You think 1970s soul food recipes are relics of the past? Think again. In an era of rising prices and uncertain times, Black families stretched pennies into plates that nourished body and spirit. Here are 60 cheap 1970s soul food recipes we need now more than ever. Cornmeal batter cakes were one of the simplest meals that could appear on a Southern table, and they carried generations of tradition within them. Families would take cornmeal, water, and sometimes a pinch of salt, stir it into a thin batter, and fry it on a hot griddle until crisp at the edges. They were plain, but they filled stomachs and could be eaten with molasses, honey, or drippings if there was any to spare. For children heading to school or workers starting long days in the fields, these cakes offered quick energy without costing much. Cornmeal was one of the most dependable ingredients because it was cheap, easy to store, and produced in abundance across the South. A few scoops stretched further than wheat flour, and it did not require yeast or fancy preparation. Cornmeal batter cakes might have been plain, but in households facing hunger, they meant survival and warmth. They were a food that held families steady when little else did. Pot scrappin' soup was the kind of meal that made use of every last bit that life gave. When the pantry was empty, people turned to what clung to the bottom of the pot. They poured in hot water, scraped up every browned edge and leftover piece of vegetable or meat, and built a new meal from what was left behind. It simmered for hours until the flavors came together, smoky and deep, with hints of salt and spice from earlier meals. No two pots ever tasted the same, and that was the beauty of it. Sometimes it had bits of onion, sometimes beans or bones, always something saved from before. It filled the air with a smell of gratitude, the kind that made even the poorest home feel rich. Children dunked stale cornbread in it, soaking up every drop. Pot scrappin' soup reminded families that nothing was ever truly gone, not flavor, not hope, not care. It turned waste into warmth and leftovers into love. The sound of that bubbling pot was a hymn for survival, proof that the end of the week still had something worth waiting for. Cocktail sausages wrapped in flaky biscuit dough emerged from ovens as golden crescents that children grabbed from cooling racks, burning their fingers but unable to wait. Mothers would roll out refrigerated biscuit dough, cutting it into strips before wrapping each small sausage like a tiny gift and arranging them on greased baking sheets. The wrapped sausages baked until the dough turned golden brown and flaky, the fat from the sausages creating pockets of rich, meaty flavor. Some families brushed the tops with melted butter and sesame seeds before baking, adding extra richness and subtle, nutty crunch. In Black households during the 1970s, these sausage rolls appeared at every major holiday, their ease of preparation making them perfect for busy cooks managing multiple dishes. Children loved them because they were small, portable, and perfectly sized for little hands. Field green salad was a dish born from foraging, when store-bought vegetables were not available or were too costly. Families would gather wild greens like dandelion, mustard, or pokeweed, clean them carefully, and toss them with vinegar or oil. These greens were bitter, but they were free, nutritious, and available almost everywhere. Field green salad offered vitamins and freshness that was often missing from wartime or depression diets, balancing the heavy starches and salted meats that dominated many meals. For children, it was sometimes an acquired taste, but adults appreciated the practicality of gathering what nature provided. Foraging for greens tied families directly to the land and created a sense of connection to survival practices passed down through generations. Field green salad reflected both hardship and resilience, reminding families that the earth itself could provide when markets could not. It was simple, frugal, and a reminder of the strength that came from resourcefulness. Fried green tomato. Po' boys turned unripe tomatoes into a sandwich that tasted like pure coastal sunshine wrapped in crunchy cornmeal. Thick slices of firm green tomatoes were dredged in seasoned cornmeal and fried until their edges crisped and their centers softened just enough to release a bright tang. Piled high on soft French bread with a smear of remoulade and a handful of shredded lettuce, they became a favorite along Gulf Coast streets where shrimp boats docked and music floated from open windows. Vendors often sold them at fish fries and fairs when seafood prices climbed too high, proving that a garden vegetable could carry the day as well as any oyster or crab. Families remembered the scent of hot oil and the pop of cornmeal batter while waiting in line for a sandwich that blended thrift and celebration. Today, fast food counters try to imitate the flavor, but they cannot capture the quiet magic of fresh garden tomatoes picked before ripening, fried in backyard kitchens, and shared among neighbors who knew the value of every bite. Cheese ball rolled in pecans sat proudly on serving platters surrounded by crackers, its cream cheese base mixed with cheddar, green onions, and seasonings before being shaped into a perfect sphere and coated with chopped pecans. Aunties would soften cream cheese and mix it with shredded sharp cheddar, finely chopped green onions, Worcestershire sauce, garlic powder, and sometimes hot sauce for complexity. The mixture was then shaped into a ball or log, wrapped in plastic, and chilled until firm enough to handle. Just before serving, the cheese ball was rolled in finely chopped pecans that created a crunchy, nutty coating contrasting beautifully with the creamy interior. In 1970s Black households, cheese balls represented sophistication and effort, centerpieces of appetizer spreads that showed guests the host had put thought into the gathering. Children loved them because they could spread the cheese themselves onto crackers, feeling grown up and independent.
Sunday dinners that took all day created layers of flavor impossible to achieve with quick cooking. African American families treated Sunday meals as sacred events, starting preparations after church and serving hours later when everything had simmered to perfection. Roasts slow cooked until fork tender, greens softened for hours absorbing pot liquor, and desserts cooled while anticipation built. This timing was about chemistry that transforms tough cuts into tender meat and vegetables into complex dishes. The house filled with aromas announcing celebration before anyone sat down. When busy schedules compressed Sunday dinners into quick meals, soul food lost the time it needed to develop properly. The dishes may share names with what we ate then, but they cannot share the depth only hours of cooking can create.
Collard green Potlikker soup was proof that nothing in the kitchen went to waste. After collard greens were boiled with ham hocks or smoked meat, the leftover broth was packed with nutrients and flavor. Families would save it, thicken it with beans, rice, or cornbread crumbs, and serve it as a soup. It turned what could have been discarded liquid into a meal that could stretch for days. Potlikker was praised for its richness and vitamins, especially during times when fresh vegetables were limited. Black families in the South cherished it as part of their food culture, a reminder that even scraps held value. The taste of Potlikker soup was smoky, salty, and comforting, carrying both sustenance and heritage in every bowl. It reminded people that resourcefulness was a form of survival and strength. For many households, it was a dish that fed both body and spirit when times were most difficult. Watermelon rind hash was a dish that proved nothing in a Southern kitchen ever truly went to waste. After the sweet red fruit was eaten down to its pale skin, the green rinds were peeled, diced, and saved for the next meal. They were boiled until soft, then tossed into a skillet with onions, peppers, and a pinch of spice. What came out of that pan was golden and glistening, sweet with a hint of salt, smelling faintly of summer rain and backyard laughter. The rind soaked up flavor like memory itself, turning something forgotten into something worth savoring. Families served it with cornbread or rice, sometimes even cold the next morning with eggs. It filled bellies when money was short and reminded everyone that resourcefulness could taste as good as plenty. The sizzle in the skillet sounded like hope, sharp and quick, the sign that something good was about to happen. Watermelon rind hash was not just food, it was gratitude on a plate. Every bite told the story of people who refused to waste even the smallest blessing. It was sweet, it was humble, and it carried the quiet genius of survival, transforming scraps into a celebration that no one ever forgot. Cheese straws made from sharp cheddar and cayenne pepper were crispy, addictive sticks that disappeared from serving bowls almost as quickly as they were refilled, their orange-gold color and spicy kick making them irresistible. Grandmothers would grate blocks of sharp cheddar by hand, mixing it with softened butter, flour, cayenne pepper, and salt until the dough came together, then pressing it through cookie presses or rolling it into long ropes before slicing. The cheese straws baked until crispy and slightly browned at the edges, filling kitchens with the sharp, tangy aroma of melting cheese mixed with subtle heat. Once cooled, they were stored in tins, maintaining crispness for days. In 1970s, Black households, cheese straws represented Southern tradition, recipes passed down through generations with each family adding their signature touch, extra cayenne, paprika, or pecans.
Fresh ground cornmeal from local mills gave 1970s cornbread a texture and flavor that commercial products have completely lost. Small mills throughout the South ground corn to order, producing meal with the germ and oils intact, giving it sweetness and depth that degerminated versions lack. This cornmeal was alive with flavor, requiring refrigeration because its natural oils would turn rancid. Cornbread made from fresh meal had crumbly richness, golden color, and taste that made it more than just a side dish. Families knew which mills produced the best meal and would drive miles to get it, understanding that this single ingredient determined quality. As small mills closed and mass production took over, cornmeal became standardized, stripped of character for shelf life. The cornbread that once anchored soul food meals became ordinary.
Charred sweet potato peel tea was the drink of those who refused to give up warmth even when comfort seemed gone. When sugar was low and coffee was nothing but memory, families gathered the peels of sweet potatoes, rinsed them, and laid them across open flames until the edges blackened and curled. The smell was deep and smoky, the scent of fire and sweetness twined together. Once roasted, the peels were steeped in boiling water, turning the liquid a soft amber brown with a flavor that felt older than the land itself. Some people added honey or molasses for richness, others drank it plain, savoring the faint caramel taste that soothed the heart. It was a quiet ritual, often shared at the end of long days, when words were few but peace was needed. The steam rose like a prayer, the kind that carried both sorrow and gratitude. Charred sweet potato peel tea was not about luxury or comfort. It was about memory, care, and the belief that warmth could always be found again. It was love brewed slowly, proof that even ashes could hold sweetness. Cowtail soup was a rustic dish that turned overlooked parts of the animal into a rich, sustaining meal. Families would simmer ox or cow tails for hours until the broth thickened, drawing out deep flavors from the bones and marrow. Vegetables like carrots, onions, and potatoes were added when available, creating a stew that was filling and full of nutrients. Cowtail soup was a dish of patience, requiring time but rewarding households with warmth and nourishment that could last days. It carried a strong, hearty flavor that reminded families of home cooking, even in years when food was scarce. Because tails were cheaper than prime cuts, they became an accessible protein source for families who could not afford much. The soup symbolized frugality and resourcefulness, proving that even bones could be transformed into meals that held people together. Cowtail soup was more than broth. It was the taste of resilience in hard times. Fried okra rounds served with ranch dressing were crispy, crunchy appetizers that introduced children to vegetables in ways that made them forget they were eating something healthy, the golden coating making every bite feel like a treat. Mothers would slice fresh okra into thick rounds, coating them first in buttermilk that helped breading adhere, then dredging them in seasoned cornmeal mixed with flour, salt, pepper, and garlic powder. The okra rounds were dropped into hot oil where they bubbled and crisped, the cornmeal coating turning golden brown while the okra inside stayed tender. Once drained on paper towels and sprinkled with extra salt while still hot, the okra was piled into serving bowls and placed near small dishes of ranch dressing that children dunked them into with enthusiasm. In Black households during the 1970s, fried okra represented Southern tradition meeting holiday hospitality. Children loved fried okra because it felt like eating fried chicken in vegetable form.
Fresh eggs from backyard chickens appeared in 1970s soul food with yolks so orange and rich they seemed to glow. Families kept small flocks scratching in yards, eating bugs and scraps, producing eggs with flavor that factory farms cannot replicate. These eggs made cornbread rise higher, custards set richer, and breakfast plates shine with color that supermarket eggs lack entirely. Children gathered eggs each morning as a chore, connecting them directly to their food. The shells were thicker, the whites firmer, and the taste unmistakably superior to anything bought in stores. When zoning laws and convenience eliminated backyard flocks from homes, soul food lost one of its most essential ingredients. Every cake, every custard, every fried egg today is a diminished version of what those backyard hens once provided.
Miniature cornbread muffins with honey butter were golden gems that children popped into their mouths whole, the crumbly cornbread texture melting while sweet honey butter added richness. Mothers would prepare cornbread batter using stone-ground cornmeal, flour, eggs, buttermilk, and just enough sugar to balance the corn's natural earthiness, then spoon it into mini muffin tins that baked quickly. The muffins emerged from ovens with crispy, slightly caramelized tops and tender, crumbly interiors that begged to be broken open and slathered with butter. Honey butter was made by whipping softened butter with honey until fluffy and smooth, creating a spread that melted instantly when slathered on hot muffins. In the 1970s, Black households, these miniature cornbread muffins represented Southern hospitality in bite-sized form. Children loved them because they were individually portioned, making them feel like special treats rather than ordinary bread, and the sweet honey butter made every bite feel indulgent and special. Molasses coffee was not fancy, but it was strong enough to keep a person going through the longest of days. When coffee beans were scarce and sugar even scarcer, someone clever discovered that a spoonful of blackstrap molasses stirred into hot water or weak brew could make a drink both sweet and smoky. The result was thick and dark, with a bitterness that clung to the tongue and warmed the chest. It tasted like work and resilience, like fields at sunrise and factory bells ringing. Families drank it early and often, some adding milk if fortune allowed, others taking it plain with bread crusts for breakfast. It was a poor man's luxury, a small rebellion against hunger and fatigue. The smell alone was enough to wake the tired and remind them that strength could be stirred, not bought. Molasses coffee was courage in a cup, shared by hands cracked from labor and hearts that refused to quit. It carried the spirit of people who built their mornings out of willpower and steam, proving that dignity could live even in the thinnest brew. Peanut soup had deep roots in West African cooking and carried over into the kitchens of Black America during times of scarcity. Families would boil peanuts until soft, grind them into a paste, and whisk them into broth with onions and seasonings. The result was a creamy, nutty soup that filled stomachs without relying on expensive meat. Because peanuts were widely available and inexpensive, this dish became a dependable source of protein and comfort. It could be served plain with bread or thickened with vegetables to stretch even further. Children grew up tasting peanut soup as a warm, sustaining dish that soothed hunger while carrying the echo of older traditions. The flavor was earthy and satisfying, reminding families of both resilience and cultural roots. Peanut soup showed that the most affordable ingredients could still produce something memorable, sustaining entire households during difficult seasons. It was not just soup, it was survival food with heritage poured into every bowl. Lard cakes were the sweetheart of hard times, the kind of dessert that brought back joy when butter was a dream. Made from flour, sugar, and a scoop of lard saved from breakfast, they baked up soft and fragrant. The smell filled the house, buttery without butter, rich without cream. People called them poverty cakes, but they tasted like victory. The lard kept them moist for days, and a touch of spice or molasses made them taste like something from a bakery. Children licked the crumbs from their fingers, not caring that it came from the same jar used for frying eggs. Every family had their own version, some with raisins, some with cinnamon, each one proud and personal. Lard cakes were a reminder that sweetness was not about luxury. It was about invention. They were proof that love could rise from scarcity, baked golden in worn pans and shared without shame. In kitchens filled with laughter and thrift, lard cakes turned necessity into delight. Butter beans cooked with ham hock and served in small cups became hearty appetizers that filled hungry children before dinner, their creamy texture and smoky flavor creating comfort in every spoonful. Grandmothers would simmer dried butter beans with ham hocks, onions, and seasonings for hours until the beans became tender and creamy while absorbing the smoky, salty flavor from the meat. The finished beans were served in small portions in cups or bowls with small spoons, allowing guests to enjoy them without needing plates. Some families topped the beans with crumbled cornbread or a drizzle of hot sauce for extra flavor and texture. In Black households during the 1970s, butter beans represented soul food tradition brought to the appetizer table, showing that holiday food could honor heritage while fitting modern entertaining formats. Children loved butter beans because they tasted familiar and comforting, like Thanksgiving dinner in miniature form that warmed them from the inside. Fried
Whole spices ground by hand in 1970s kitchens released oils and aromatics that pre-ground versions have already lost. Cooks kept nutmeg whole and grated it fresh over sweet potato pie, cracked peppercorns in mortars, and toasted cumin seeds before crushing them. This extra step made enormous difference because spices begin losing potency the moment they are ground, and commercial powders may sit for months. The fragrance that filled kitchens when spices were freshly prepared announced that something special was being made. Grandmothers knew this intuitively, keeping small grinders beside their stoves. The convenience of pre-ground spices saved time but sacrificed intensity that made soul food memorable. What we shake from bottles now is a ghost of the flavor that fresh grinding once provided.
Catfish stew was a hearty dish that brought riverside living directly into the kitchen. Catfish was plentiful in southern waters and could be caught by hand or with simple nets, making it accessible to families with little money. The fish was simmered in a tomato-based broth with onions, peppers, and sometimes potatoes, creating a stew that was filling and flavorful. Served with rice or cornbread, it became a meal that could feed many people from just a few ingredients. Catfish stew represented more than thrift. It symbolized self-sufficiency and the ability to survive off the land and water. For Black families, it was also a dish tied to community, as fishing trips often brought people together. The stew carried smoky, tangy flavors that warmed the soul, reminding everyone at the table of home. In times of hardship, catfish stew was both sustenance and tradition, feeding generations with simple but powerful nourishment. Hominy crackle porridge was the kind of breakfast that came from patience, not plenty. When there was no bacon, no biscuits, and not much else in the pantry, leftover hominy saved the day. It was stirred into a pot with water or milk, sweetened with molasses, and spiced with nutmeg or cinnamon if you had it. The sound of the spoon scraping against the pot made a rhythm that felt almost like music, slow and steady like morning itself. When the porridge bubbled, it released a scent both earthy and rich, a blend of smoke, sugar, and warmth. Children would sit waiting with chipped bowls in their hands, ready for the first ladle. It was thick and creamy, sometimes with a thin golden crust if it sat long enough. Hominy crackle porridge filled bellies and lifted moods, turning scraps into something special. It reminded families that sweetness did not depend on sugar alone, but on love and endurance. Every spoonful was a story of thrift and tenderness, made from what was left and shared without complaint. When the bowl was empty, people still felt full, not just from the food, but from the comfort it brought to a hard world made softer by care. Bacon-wrapped water chestnuts delivered crispy, salty, and slightly sweet bites that children fought over despite not knowing exactly what water chestnuts were, the bacon exterior and crunchy interior creating mysterious but delicious combinations. Aunties would drain cans of whole water chestnuts, wrapping each one with half a strip of bacon and securing it with toothpicks before arranging them on baking sheets. Before baking, Each bundle was brushed with a mixture of brown sugar and soy sauce that caramelized during cooking, creating a sweet salty glaze that coated the bacon. The water chestnuts roasted until the bacon was crispy and rendered, the fat dripping away while the sugar coating turned golden brown and slightly sticky. In Black households during the 1970s, bacon-wrapped water chestnuts represented sophistication borrowed from magazines, recipes that seemed fancy but remained simple for home cooks. Children loved them because bacon made everything better.
Community fish fries brought neighborhoods together around freshly caught catfish cooked in massive outdoor kettles. Men who knew local rivers supplied the fish, cleaning them while women prepared cornmeal batter and heated oil over wood fires. The social dimension mattered as much as food because these gatherings strengthened bonds and created shared memories. Children ran between tables while elders sat telling stories, and everyone ate fish so fresh it had been swimming that morning. The cornmeal coating crisped in properly heated oil, the flesh inside stayed moist, and the entire experience felt like celebration. When these community events became rare, soul food lost one of its essential contexts. The fish we eat now may be fried correctly, but it cannot replicate what those gatherings meant.
Chicken salad stuffed in cherry tomatoes created colorful, bite-sized portions that children eagerly grabbed. The cool, creamy chicken salad contrasting with the fresh, slightly tart tomato cups that held everything together. Aunties would hollow out cherry tomatoes using small spoons or melon ballers, creating little edible bowls that were functional and beautiful when arranged on serving platters. The chicken salad was made from finely chopped cooked chicken mixed with mayonnaise, diced celery, sweet pickle relish, and seasonings. The mixture kept cold until serving time. Each hollowed tomato was filled with a generous spoonful of chicken salad, mounded slightly on top for visual appeal. In 1970s Black households, these stuffed tomatoes represented creativity and presentation, transforming simple ingredients into appetizers that looked impressive enough for special occasions. Children loved them because they were perfectly portioned, colorful, and combined familiar flavors in a fun format. Mustard greens with cornbread was a savory pairing that many families leaned on as a breakfast, though it was eaten at other times of day too. Mustard greens, boiled until tender, were seasoned with bits of pork fat or salt for flavor. Eaten alongside hot cornbread, the meal balanced vitamins with starch, offering both nutrition and energy. It was cheap, filling, and deeply tied to tradition. For children, the bitterness of the greens was often softened by crumbling cornbread into the Potlikker broth, making it more palatable. Adults valued it as a sustaining meal that honored resourcefulness and cultural heritage. Mustard greens with cornbread symbolized strength and survival, representing the kind of food that nourished more than just hunger. It was humble, but it carried families through mornings when resources were thin, but resolve was strong. This dish was one of the quiet backbones of community kitchens, a reflection of endurance and resilience during times of hardship. Ash cakes were one of the oldest and simplest forms of survival food, baked directly in the ashes of a fire. Cornmeal dough was shaped into patties, placed in hot embers, and brushed clean once cooked. They were smoky, rustic, and filling, often eaten with molasses or a bit of lard if available. Ash cakes reflected a time when ovens were not always accessible and fire was the only tool families had. They were practical and symbolic, tied to centuries of African American resilience and the resourceful use of corn. Families leaned on ash cakes during journeys, hard work days, and lean years, carrying both history and sustenance in every bite. Eating them meant returning to the most basic form of nourishment, stripped of luxury but full of meaning. Ash cakes were humble food that carried dignity, a reminder that even in the most limited circumstances, people found ways to survive and share. Mud pie was not the dessert people think of today, but a savory meal that brought warmth when meat was scarce. It began with mashed potatoes, thick and creamy from yesterday's supper, spread across the bottom of a pan. A layer of bread crusts came next, torn from loaves that had grown stiff with time. Then came a pour of rich brown gravy, made from drippings and flour, seeping into the bread and potatoes like rain into soil. When it baked, the top turned dark and glossy, the inside soft and heavy with flavor. It looked muddy, hence its name, but it tasted like comfort itself. Families made it on Sundays, when scraps were gathered and hope was baked back into the week. The smell filled the house and called everyone to the table. Children fought for the crispy corners while parents smiled in quiet relief. Mud pie carried pride in every bite, the kind of pride that came from making something out of almost nothing. It was a meal that felt like a miracle, served hot from the oven and eaten slow, one spoonful at a time, a reminder that even hard days could end sweetly. Cowpea fritters were a dish that came straight out of resilience and memory, with roots reaching back to African cooking traditions. Families would soak and mash dried cowpeas, mix them with a little onion, cornmeal, and seasoning, then fry the mixture in hot lard until crisp on the outside and soft inside. They were cheap, filling, and carried the rich protein that many households could not always get from meat. For Black families in the South, cowpeas were already a staple crop, so using them to create something hearty made perfect sense. These fritters could be eaten plain or dipped in gravy, and they were often made in batches large enough to last a day or two. They carried a deep sense of history, because this kind of cooking showed how old world techniques adapted to the realities of hard times in America. They were not only nourishment, but also a connection to ancestors who had relied on the same beans for strength. Deviled eggs with paprika and pickle relish were the appetizer children fought over at every Thanksgiving gathering, their bright yellow centers dotted with red paprika creating tiny works of art. Grandmothers would boil dozens of eggs the night before, peeling them while warm and slicing lengthwise before scooping yolks into mixing bowls. The yolks were mashed with mayonnaise, yellow mustard, sweet pickle relish, and vinegar until perfectly creamy, then spooned back into egg white halves. Paprika sprinkled on top added color and smokiness. In Black households during the 1970s, deviled eggs symbolized celebration, appearing at every gathering from church dinners to reunions. Children would hover near the kitchen, waiting to sneak one before dinner, knowing that once adults arrived, these treats would disappear. The combination of creamy richness, tangy pickle brightness, and paprika's heat satisfied everyone.
Cast iron skillets were the heartbeat of every African-American kitchen in the 1970s, seasoned over decades with layers of flavor no modern pan could replicate. These heavy black skillets had been passed down through generations, their surfaces holding the memory of thousands of meals. Every fried chicken breast, every pan of cornbread, every batch of smothered pork chops absorbed and contributed to that irreplaceable seasoning. The iron distributed heat evenly and slowly, creating crusts impossible to achieve on non-stick surfaces. Families guarded these skillets fiercely, never letting soap touch them, only wiping them clean and rubbing them with fat. The food that emerged carried depth from history itself. Modern cookware may be convenient, but it cannot hold the taste of time the way those blackened skillets did.
Fried corn pone was a dish that required almost nothing but cornmeal, water, and lard. Yet it managed to fill stomachs during times of want. It was denser than cornbread and more rustic, formed into small patties and fried in cast iron skillets until golden. Families leaned on it for breakfast, lunch, or supper because it was inexpensive, used ingredients they almost always had, and could be made quickly. Corn was abundant across the South, and every pantry had a sack of cornmeal that could be stretched into meals again and again. Eating fried corn pone often meant there was no wheat bread to be had, but no one went hungry. It was eaten with beans, dipped in potlikker, or just on its own with a smear of molasses or syrup if available. Fried corn pone reflected the determination to create something warm and satisfying even when the cupboards were close to bare. Eggshell pudding was an act of pure ingenuity, a sweet custard built from things no one thought could be used. Families saved eggshells, washed and dried them, then ground them into powder for extra calcium. That powder went into milk, sugar, and cornstarch, stirred together until it thickened over the stove. It set in jars or bowls, smooth and pale, a dessert that looked humble but held the taste of patience. It was soft, slightly sweet, and carried the faint scent of vanilla if a family could afford it. Children thought it was magic, how scraps turned into something good. It filled more than bellies. It filled hearts with gratitude. Eggshell pudding was the promise that nothing had to go to waste, that even the smallest fragments had purpose. In every spoonful was the spirit of endurance, a quiet hymn to survival sung right from the kitchen stove. Salmon croquettes served as mini appetizers were crispy golden patties that children devoured while standing in kitchens, their hands reaching for more before finishing what they were already eating. Grandmothers would drain cans of pink salmon, carefully picking through the meat to remove bones and skin, then flaking the fish into mixing bowls where it was combined with chopped onions, bell peppers, beaten eggs, cornmeal, and seasonings. The mixture was shaped into small patties, pressed firmly to ensure they held together, then carefully lowered into hot oil where they sizzled and turned golden brown. The exterior developed a crispy crust while the interior stayed moist and flavorful. In 1970s, Black households' salmon croquettes were economical elegance, transforming canned fish into something special worthy of holiday tables. Children loved them because they were handheld, didn't require forks, and packed protein and flavor into every crispy bite.
Rendered bacon fat stored in jars beside every stove was the secret weapon of 1970s soul food that modern kitchens have abandoned. This precious grease, saved from breakfast and accumulated over weeks, added smoky depth to vegetables and gravies that no other fat could provide. Cooks spooned it into cast iron before frying eggs, stirred it into green beans, and used it to start dishes that would otherwise taste flat. The fat carried concentrated pork flavor, transforming simple ingredients into something memorable. Children watched their mothers strain hot bacon grease into waiting containers, learning that waste was unacceptable and flavor worth saving. When health concerns eliminated this practice, soul food lost an essential flavor foundation. The dishes we make now without rendered fat are missing what made them worth eating.
Crowder pea stew was a variant of black-eyed peas that found its way into countless kitchens during hard years. Crowder peas, smaller and creamier than black-eyed peas, were simmered down with onions, peppers, and bits of smoked meat if any were available. The stew was thick, filling, and high in protein, making it essential for families who needed food that stretched far. Served with cornbread or rice, Crowder pea stew could feed many mouths at little cost. It was one of those dishes that reflected the ingenuity of turning simple legumes into full meals that carried flavor and strength. The stew also tied into a long history of peas as a staple in African and Southern food traditions. Families leaned on it not only because it was affordable, but because it was familiar and comforting. Crowder pea stew was more than food. It was a lifeline and a cultural anchor in times of scarcity. Onion skin tea was one of those old remedies that could quiet both body and soul. When someone had a cough or a fever, or when food simply ran out, a pot of this humble tea came to the rescue. Dried onion skins were gathered from the corners of the kitchen, rinsed and steeped in boiling water until the liquid turned golden brown. The scent was sharp but comforting, a mix of earth and sweetness that filled the air with warmth. Some added honey if they had it, or a squeeze of lemon, but even plain, it had its own charm. People believed it could heal and strengthen, and maybe it did, because hope itself can be medicine. Onion skin tea was born from patience, brewed by hands that knew how to stretch every last bit of life from what they had. It was the taste of resilience and care, a sip that made you believe tomorrow might be gentler. Rumaki-wrapped chicken livers and water chestnuts in bacon created sophisticated bites that curious children tried, the crispy bacon exterior making them willing to taste the unfamiliar liver that turned out mild. Aunties would cut chicken livers into bite-sized pieces, marinate them briefly in soy sauce and ginger, then wrap them with water chestnut slices in bacon before securing everything with toothpicks. The bundles were arranged on baking sheets and roasted until the bacon crisped and rendered, the fat keeping the liver moist while adding smoky saltiness that transformed the organ meat into something special. As they cooked, the soy sauce caramelized slightly, creating a sweet savory glaze that coated the bacon. In Black households during the 1970s, rumaki represented culinary adventurousness, recipes borrowed from magazines that brought international flavors to holiday tables. Children who were brave enough to try them discovered that bacon really did make everything better.
Lard rendering and storage techniques were essential knowledge that determined the quality of every fried dish coming from African American kitchens. Families acquired fresh pork fat from local butchers, cut it into small cubes, and cooked it slowly over the lowest heat for hours. The process required constant attention, stirring regularly to prevent scorching, while fat liquefied into pure white liquid gold. Once rendered, lard was strained through cheesecloth multiple times to remove crackling remnants that could burn during frying. Storage was equally precise, with families keeping rendered lard in ceramic crocks or glass jars in cool cellars where it remained fresh for months. Some households added salt to extend shelf life. This homemade lard produced fried foods with flavors that commercial shortenings could never duplicate.
Sweet potato biscuits with honey were a beloved comfort food that turned humble ingredients into something special. Sweet potatoes were plentiful in the South, cheap to grow, and full of natural sweetness. By mashing them into biscuit dough, families created soft, tender breads that did not require as much flour or fat. Fresh biscuits out of the oven were topped with a drizzle of local honey if it was available, making them feel indulgent despite their simplicity. These biscuits were often served for breakfast, but they could also accompany stews or fried fish. They filled stomachs and brought warmth to the table, offering both nutrition and comfort. Sweet potatoes symbolized resilience, and honey added a touch of hope in difficult times. Together, they created a dish that carried meaning well beyond its taste. Sweet potato biscuits with honey reflected the heart of soul food, making something beautiful and memorable from ingredients that were always within reach. Okra fritters with corn silk were the kind of kitchen magic that only came from necessity and imagination. In the long summer months, when the fields were full and money was not, people used every part of what they harvested. The corn silk that clung to the ears was not thrown away, but saved and shredded, added into batter alongside chopped okra, flour, and a splash of milk or water. When dropped into hot oil, the fritters puffed and crackled, their edges turning golden and crisp. The smell was something you could follow from down the road. Warm, nutty, and sweet with that faint scent of corn. Each bite was crunchy on the outside and tender in the middle, with little strings of corn silk that gave it texture and charm. They were served with syrup or vinegar, depending on what the family had, eaten right out of the pan when patience ran out. Okra fritters with corn silk were food born from care and cleverness, proof that waste had no place in a humble kitchen. Every family had its own version, passed quietly between generations, carrying the taste of late afternoons, hard work, and simple joy. They were poverty's poetry, fried into something worth remembering. Crab cakes formed into mini patties were seafood luxury that made Thanksgiving feel extra special. The sweet crab meat mixed with breadcrumbs and seasonings before being pan-fried until golden. Grandmothers would pick through cans of crab meat to remove any shell pieces, then gently fold the delicate meat with beaten eggs, breadcrumbs, mayonnaise, mustard, Old Bay seasoning, and sometimes diced bell peppers. The mixture was formed into small patties, each one handled carefully, then refrigerated briefly to help them hold together during cooking. The crab cakes were pan-fried in butter until golden brown on both sides, the exterior developing a crispy crust while the interior stayed moist and packed with sweet crab flavor. In the 1970s, Black households, crab cakes represented coastal sophistication, bringing seafood traditions to holiday tables and elevating the appetizer spread. Children loved mini crab cakes because they felt fancy, tasted sweet rather than fishy, and came in sizes perfect for young appetites.
Well, water from deep sources gave 1970s soul food a mineral quality that treated city water cannot provide. Rural families drew water from wells dug by ancestors. Its taste clean and slightly earthy with trace minerals affecting everything it touched. This water made tea taste richer, soup broth deeper, and beans cooked to better texture than chlorinated municipal supplies. Cooks knew intuitively that water mattered, even if they could not explain why. Coffee brewed with well water had roundness that tap water flattens, and vegetables simmered in it absorbed subtle flavors. When rural families moved to cities or connected to municipal systems, this invisible ingredient disappeared. The same recipes made with treated water taste different in ways most people cannot identify, but somehow notice.
Pimento cheese pinwheels made with tortillas spread with creamy pimento cheese and rolled into tight spirals created colorful, easy-to-eat bites that children grabbed enthusiastically. Aunties would spread flour tortillas with homemade pimento cheese made from sharp cheddar, cream cheese, diced pimentos, mayonnaise, and seasonings. The tortillas were then rolled tightly into logs, wrapped in plastic wrap, and refrigerated for several hours to firm up and make slicing easier. Once chilled, the logs were unwrapped and sliced into rounds about half an inch thick, each pinwheel revealing the bright orange cheese dotted with red pimento pieces. In 1970s, Black households' pimento cheese pinwheels represented modern entertaining, a variation on traditional pimento cheese that made serving easier and more elegant. Children loved pimento cheese pinwheels because they were perfectly portioned, colorful, and tasted like their favorite spread in a fun new format. Corn husk pudding was dessert for those who knew how to make the earth sweet. Fresh corn was grated by hand until the bowl filled with golden pulp, then mixed with butter, brown sugar, and milk. The batter was spooned into husks and tied with twine before being steamed until tender. When peeled open, the pudding glowed with a soft yellow shine, smelling of sugar and summer air. Its texture was smooth, its flavor deep and gentle. Families made it for celebrations or simply to remember happier days. It was the kind of sweetness that did not rush, a joy built slowly over a simmering pot. The husks were more than wrappers. They were vessels of gratitude, holding together flavor, memory, and time. Each bite tasted like sunshine, patience, and the steady hands that never stopped creating beauty from simplicity. Corn husk pudding was proof that sweetness does not need gold or cream, only the wisdom to cherish what you already have. It was the song of Southern kitchens, tender and enduring. Corn husk tamales in the Delta carried a story of adaptation and resilience, blending African-American creativity with Mexican influence. Families filled corn husks with seasoned cornmeal dough and sometimes small bits of pork or vegetables, then simmered them slowly until firm. They were portable, hearty, and could stretch a handful of ingredients into meals for many. In the Delta, these tamales became a community staple, often sold from wagons or small kitchens to neighbors who could not afford restaurant food. Wrapped in corn husks, they represented thrift and tradition, proof that families could borrow from other foodways and make it their own. Tamales were often shared at gatherings or passed around during long workdays, feeding both body and spirit. They carried the memory of cornfields and the smell of simmering pots, becoming part of African-American culinary history. Delta tamales showed that even in hard times, food could carry flavor, heritage, and strength into the lives of those who needed it most. Soot biscuits were the kind of food you learned to trust when the fire was all you had. They were baked in soot-covered Dutch ovens, set right into the coals until the smell of toasted flour filled the air. The outsides came out black and charred, but inside they were soft, warm, and sweet from the faint taste of smoke. You brushed off the ash and split them open, steam rising like a small blessing. They were eaten with syrup, molasses, or even gravy if the morning allowed it. Families traveling, camping, or working the land knew this trick well. It was food that came straight from the earth and fire, raw and honest. Soot biscuits did not look like much, but they carried pride. They were proof that comfort could come from the simplest effort, that even ashes could feed the body and soothe the soul. The smell lingered on your hands and clothes, a reminder that good things sometimes came wrapped in smoke. Each bite tasted like work and gratitude, the flavor of survival baked in real flame. Cocktail meatballs simmered in grape jelly and chili sauce created sweet, savory bites that children couldn't resist, the glossy sauce coating each meatball like candy while delivering unexpected flavors. Mothers would brown frozen meatballs in skillets before transferring them to slow cookers or pots where they simmered in a mixture of grape jelly and bottled chili sauce that melted together into a thick, shiny glaze. The combination sounded strange but tasted magical, the grape jelly's sweetness balancing the chili sauce's tang and creating a flavor profile that kept people reaching for more. As the meatballs simmered, they absorbed the sauce and became tender, the exterior developing a sticky coating that made them perfect for spearing with toothpicks. In Black households during the 1970s, these cocktail meatballs represented easy elegance, a recipe that seemed fancy but required minimal effort. Children loved them because they were bite-sized, required no cutting, and tasted like a sweet, savory treat.
Collard greens from the garden carried sweetness and tenderness in the 1970s that shipped in bunches have lost entirely. Families planted collards in spring and fall, harvesting leaves at their peak after the first frost converted their starches to sugar. These greens were massive, deep green, and so fresh they squeaked when washed. Cooking them was an all-day affair, simmering low with smoked meat until they became silky and rich with potlikker worth drinking alone. The taste was simultaneously bitter, sweet, and savory in a balance that grocery store collards cannot achieve. Children who grew up eating garden collards developed a taste that mass-produced versions could never satisfy. The connection between soil, season, and table gave these greens meaning beyond nutrition, making them taste like heritage itself.
Sorghum syrup bread was a wartime and Depression-era answer to expensive refined sugar. Sorghum, a tall grass grown widely in the South, was boiled down into a thick, dark syrup that tasted earthy and sweet. Families would use it in place of sugar, mixing it into simple bread doughs to stretch rations and still enjoy something satisfying. Sorghum syrup bread was hearty, with a flavor that carried a touch of bitterness but warmed the spirit. Children often slathered slices with butter or drippings, while adults enjoyed it with strong coffee. It was a farm food at its core, tied directly to the fields where sorghum stalks grew. Sorghum bread meant that no one had to give up sweetness completely even when sugar prices were too high or stores ran out. This loaf was practical, easy to make at home, and deeply tied to southern soil. After times of scarcity passed, sorghum faded, but the memory of that dark bread stayed. Grease gravy rice was what people cooked when they refused to let anything go to waste. When breakfast meats were done frying, the leftover grease became treasure. A spoon of flour went in first, sizzling and popping until it turned golden. Then milk or water got poured in, slow and steady, until it thickened into smooth gravy. That hot gravy poured over white rice made something out of nearly nothing. It was salty, creamy, and smoky all at once. The smell filled the house and the taste filled the stomach. Parents called it breakfast, but it could carry a family through an entire day. It came from kitchens that knew survival like a second language, where flavor was earned from thrift and patience. Kids grew up thinking it was comfort food, not knowing it was born from rationing and struggle. Grease gravy rice was more than a recipe. It was a declaration that no meal was too small to matter. Every bite was a promise that the family would eat, even when times were lean. It was humble food that carried pride on a spoon. Shrimp cocktail served in small cups with tangy cocktail sauce was elegant finger food that made children feel sophisticated. The cold, tender shrimp dipped in spicy sweet sauce, creating flavors that seemed fancy. Mothers would boil shrimp in seasoned water with Old Bay seasoning, lemon, and bay leaves until they turned pink and curled, then plunge them into ice water to stop the cooking. Once chilled, the shrimp were peeled and deveined, their tails left on for easy handling, then arranged around small cups filled with cocktail sauce made from ketchup, horseradish, lemon juice, and Worcestershire sauce. The cocktail sauce had a sharp, tangy kick that balanced the shrimp's natural sweetness, creating combinations that felt restaurant quality. In the 1970s, Black households, shrimp cocktail represented luxury and celebration, an appetizer that elevated holiday gatherings. Children loved shrimp cocktail because they could hold the shrimp by the tail and dip them like French fries.
Smoked meats from local smokehouses gave 1970s soul food a depth of flavor that liquid smoke cannot approach. Small operations throughout the South smoked hams, bacon, and sausages using hardwood fires tended for days, infusing meat with genuine smoke character. These smokehouses were community institutions where families brought hogs after fall butchering. The meat emerged transformed, its fat rendered and flavored, its taste complex with notes of oak, hickory, or pecan. This smoked pork seasoned every pot of greens, every batch of beans, every skillet of vegetables. When industrial processing replaced local smokehouses, soul food lost access to this irreplaceable ingredient. What we buy now labeled smoked is merely flavored, carrying none of the authentic character that once defined every dish.
Old-fashioned tea cakes tasted like quiet afternoons and childhood visits to Grandma's house, their soft sugar cookie texture carrying a gentle vanilla fragrance. Butter, sugar, and fresh eggs were beaten together until light, then mixed with flour and a hint of nutmeg to create a dough that chilled before baking. Rolled and cut into simple rounds, the cakes puffed slightly as they baked, filling the kitchen with a sweet, buttery aroma. Neither overly sweet nor bland, they struck a perfect balance that invited dunking in tea or milk. Families treasured these cookies for their simplicity and the way they invited conversation, often baking them in large batches to share with neighbors. In the 1970s, tea cakes were a quiet staple of African American hospitality, a link to centuries of tradition. Each soft bite carried the comfort of home and the memory of loving hands, reminding everyone that sometimes the most unassuming desserts are the ones that linger longest in the heart. Turnip and potato hash was a skillet meal that worked wonders when meat was scarce or simply unavailable. Families would dice turnips and potatoes, fry them together in drippings or lard, and season them with onions, salt, and pepper. The combination produced a dish that was both hearty and inexpensive, making it a frequent breakfast or supper in households trying to stretch limited supplies. Turnips were especially important because they were cheap, easy to grow, and available in gardens or local markets. Blended with potatoes, they created bulk without requiring meat to make a plate feel substantial. This hash was also flexible, with families adding whatever scraps of vegetables they had on hand to improve flavor. Though simple, it offered warmth and familiarity to those who often faced uncertainty at mealtime. Turnip and potato hash might not have been glamorous, but it carried families through tough years and gave comfort with every bite.
Seasonal cooking and preservation meant that 1970s soul food followed rhythms modern convenience has erased. Families ate what grew in current seasons and preserved the rest through canning, smoking, and pickling. Summer meant fresh tomatoes and corn, fall brought sweet potatoes, and winter relied on what had been put up during abundant months. This approach meant anticipation for favorite foods and genuine appreciation when they appeared. Canned tomatoes made in August carried summer flavor through cold months, and pickled vegetables added brightness to winter meals. The connection between earth and table was immediate. When supermarkets made everything available year-round, soul food lost its calendar and the special meaning seasonal availability once provided. Eating strawberries in January eliminates the joy waiting once created.
Sausage balls made with breakfast sausage, cheese, and biscuit mix, baked into savory spheres that children popped into their mouths like candy, their crispy exteriors giving way to soft, cheesy, slightly spicy interiors. Mothers would combine raw breakfast sausage with shredded sharp cheddar cheese and dry biscuit mix, kneading everything together until well combined. The mixture was then rolled into balls about an inch in diameter, arranged on baking sheets with space between them, and baked until golden brown. As they baked, the fat from the sausage rendered while the cheese melted, creating savory, flavorful bites that were crispy outside and tender inside. In the 1970s, Black households, sausage balls represented easy entertaining, a recipe that could be made ahead. Children loved sausage balls because they were perfectly portioned, required no utensils, and delivered breakfast flavors in snackable form. Okra fritters, also known as okra cakes, offered crisp, golden edges and a tender interior that celebrated the summer garden. Fresh okra pods were chopped fine, mixed with cornmeal, onions, and a dash of pepper, then spooned into hot oil until each patty puffed and browned. Sold at fish fries, church picnics, and traveling fairs, these fritters were easy to eat by hand and full of flavor that tied African heritage to southern soil. The okra gave a subtle sweetness and a soft binding that kept the patties moist while the cornmeal crust provided satisfying crunch. Children waited impatiently beside bubbling skillets, hoping for the first fritter to cool enough to taste. Vendors wrapped them in newspaper cones so families could stroll through evening air scented with music and spice. Modern snack foods have replaced these handcrafted treats, but those who remember the sound of oil popping and the taste of garden-fresh okra know the fritters carried more than flavor. They held the joy of gathering and the pride of turning humble crops into a festival of taste. Hoop cheese with cornbread was a combination that felt special even though it was simple. Hoop cheese, a fresh, firm cheese pressed into round molds, was cheap and sold in local stores or from wagons. Paired with hot cornbread, it created a meal that was filling, wholesome, and comforting. Hoop cheese was not always available, which made it a rare treat in some households, something to be savored when it could be afforded. Cornbread, however, was always on the table, making the pairing feel like an upgrade from the everyday. The salty, tangy cheese balanced the sweetness of fresh cornmeal bread, creating a taste that lingered long in memory. Hoop cheese with cornbread reminded families that even small luxuries mattered, lifting spirits during times of hardship. It was proof that joy could be found in simple pairings, even in kitchens with little to spare. For many, it was comfort in its purest form. Sorrel leaf stew was the taste of home for generations who carried their roots wherever life took them. The wild green leaves, bright and tangy, grew freely along fences and fields, waiting for careful hands to gather them. Washed and simmered with onions, garlic, and a little oil, they softened into a dark green broth that shimmered in the pot. Sometimes salted pork or dried fish bones were added for depth, but even without them, the stew stood proud. Its flavor was sharp and earthy, sour and comforting all at once. For families from the coastal South and Caribbean, this dish was not just food. It was a memory of sunlight, laughter, and work well done. It was a taste of mothers stirring pots over open fires, of children running barefoot through red dirt yards. Sorrel leaf stew reminded everyone that strength grew from soil and struggle, that flavor could come from the simplest gift of the land. When a spoon dipped into that steaming bowl, it carried the sound of old prayers and soft voices calling people to eat. In every swallow lived the rhythm of survival, steady and sure, like the ocean tides that shaped those who first made it. Sweet potato bites topped with mini marshmallows were dessert-like appetizers that blurred the line between side dish and treat, their orange flesh and white topping creating visual appeal that drew children like magnets before dinner was served. Mothers would bake sweet potatoes until soft, then scoop out the flesh and mash it with butter, brown sugar, cinnamon, nutmeg, and vanilla extract until smooth and creamy. The sweetened sweet potato mixture was spooned into mini muffin tins or shaped into small balls and placed on baking sheets, each one topped with a single mini marshmallow that would toast golden brown. As they baked, the marshmallows puffed up and turned golden, creating that characteristic toasted flavor that children associated with campfires and summer fun. In the 1970s Black households, these bites represented creativity, taking traditional candied yams and reimagining them as finger foods children could grab.
Hand-churned butter, appeared on soul food tables throughout the 1970s, offering richness that store-bought sticks could never match. Families with rural connections often received fresh butter made the old way, its color deeper and flavor more complex than anything mass-produced. This butter melted into hot cornbread with sweet nuttiness, transformed vegetables into something luxurious, and made biscuits taste special. Churning required patience and willingness to work for quality rather than accepting convenience. Even urban families sometimes made their own when cream was available, treating it as a connection to traditions. The taste difference was unmistakable. Modern butter, standardized for shelf stability, carries none of the character that homemade versions brought to every plate they touched.
Stewed okra and tomatoes were the kind of dish that took simple garden produce and turned it into something nourishing enough to feed a family. Okra, a vegetable with African origins, thrived in southern soil, while tomatoes grew easily in backyard gardens. Together, simmered slowly with onions, spices, and sometimes a scrap of salt pork, they created a stew that was tangy, savory, and thick. Families relied on it because it stretched small harvests into larger meals, often served over rice or with cornbread to make it filling. The dish was especially important when meat was too expensive to buy, as it added depth and nutrition without needing animal protein. Stewed okra and tomatoes became more than food. They were a way to survive with what the land provided. For many, the taste carried reminders of summer gardens and the hard work it took to keep families fed. It was frugal, delicious, and a perfect example of survival cooking. Pea hull broth was a whisper of a meal, simple but steady. It started after shelling peas for supper, when the hulls piled high in the bowl. Instead of tossing them, families boiled them down into a thin, tea-colored broth. The scent filled the room, earthy and green, like the smell of gardens after rain. Some added salt, others a small spoon of butter, but most drank it plain, grateful for what it offered. It was a tonic for the tired, a light soup for those who had more hunger than food. During lean seasons, it became the first course and sometimes the only course. It carried vitamins, flavor, and memory in one humble bowl. Pea hull broth showed the wisdom in using everything, even what others called waste. It was not fancy, but it was faithful, feeding families with nothing more than time, heat, and care. The warmth of it settled deep, a quiet kind of comfort that made the world feel generous again. Asparagus wrapped in ham created elegant finger food that introduced children to vegetables they might not try otherwise, the salty ham making the asparagus taste less intimidating. Mothers would blanch fresh asparagus spears briefly in boiling water until they turned bright green and became slightly tender, then plunge them into ice water. Each asparagus spear was then wrapped with a thin slice of deli ham, sometimes spread with cream cheese or mustard first for extra flavor. The wrapped spears were arranged on serving platters, sometimes secured with toothpicks if the ham wouldn't stay wrapped. In Black households during the 1970s, asparagus wrapped in ham represented sophistication borrowed from magazine recipes, appetizers that looked impressive enough for special occasions. Children loved them because the ham provided familiar salty flavor, while the asparagus added crunch and color, making vegetables feel like treats rather than obligations.
Church dinners and potlucks created competition that pushed cooks to their absolute best every single time. Women brought signature dishes, knowing they would be judged against neighbors who had been perfecting the same recipes for decades. This friendly rivalry elevated soul food because reputations depended on performance, and no one wanted to bring home an untouched dish. The church basement became a testing ground where only the finest versions of fried chicken, greens, and cakes survived. Cooks guarded secrets while trying to outdo each other, creating an environment rewarding excellence. Children learned early which church mother made the best potato salad. When church attendance declined and potlucks became rare, soul food lost this crucible of quality that had refined recipes for generations.
Boiled peanuts may sound like a simple snack, but they carried deep meaning during times when money was short. Fresh green peanuts were harvested from fields and boiled slowly in salted water until soft, turning them into something filling and protein-rich. They were sold by street vendors, shared at church gatherings, and eaten hot from pots on family stoves. The salty, earthy flavor made them addictive, and because peanuts were relatively inexpensive, they became a food that was both affordable and sustaining. For many Black families, boiled peanuts represented community and togetherness as much as they did thrift. They were eaten by hand, cracked open while people talked, sang, or worked, making them a food tied closely to everyday life. In hard times, they were cheap enough to feel like a small luxury, a treat that was still practical. Boiled peanuts became more than food. They were a shared memory, passed down across generations. Ash cake bread was born out of fire and hunger, a recipe that came alive in the heart of hard times. Cornmeal, salt, and water were all it needed. The dough was pressed together by hand and buried right into the hot ashes of a wood fireplace. It baked slowly, the outside hardening into a smoky crust, while the inside stayed soft, golden, and warm. When it came out, people brushed away the ashes, broke it open, and drizzled it with syrup or molasses. It had a taste that was both sweet and earthy, like the memory of home on a Sunday morning. Ash cake bread was a working person's meal, something you could make after a long day without needing an oven or a fancy pan. It was food that did not waste or wait, made for those who had nothing extra but still found comfort in what little they had. The smell of it filled small cabins and quiet kitchens, the sound of the crackling fire mixing with laughter or prayer. Every crumb reminded people that strength could grow even from ashes. Fried chicken wings with hot sauce and butter created sticky, finger-licking appetizers that had children lined up before dinner was announced, their crispy exteriors giving way to tender meat falling off the bone. Families prepared massive batches on Thanksgiving morning, seasoning them with salt, pepper, garlic powder, and paprika, before dredging in flour and dropping into cast-iron skillets filled with bubbling hot oil. The wings fried until golden brown and crackling crisp, filling kitchens with aromas that drew everyone from every corner. Once drained and still hot, wings were tossed in melted butter and hot sauce, the heat always bold and spicy. In the 1970s, Black households, these wings represented abundance, showing guests everyone was welcome to eat their fill. Children loved them because they were handheld, required no utensils, and delivered maximum flavor with every bite. Chicken neck gravy was the very definition of stretching scraps into a full meal. Poultry was expensive and few families could afford large cuts, so nothing from a chicken ever went to waste. Necks were simmered slowly to release every bit of flavor, then thickened into a gravy with flour and drippings. Poured over rice, mashed potatoes, or biscuits, it transformed the cheapest part of the bird into something filling and comforting. Families looked forward to it because it stretched one bird into several meals, ensuring nothing was thrown away. This kind of resourcefulness defined survival cooking, and for many Black families in the South, it was routine. Chicken neck gravy might not have been glamorous, but it represented pride in making the most out of very little. It also carried the feeling of home, the scent of gravy simmering on the stove, and the relief of knowing everyone at the table would leave fed. Pigs in blankets made with cocktail franks wrapped in crescent roll dough emerged from ovens as perfect little packages that children ate by the handful, their small size making them perfect for young appetites and hands that grabbed multiple pieces at once. Mothers would unroll refrigerated crescent dough, separating it along the perforations before cutting each triangle in half to create smaller pieces that wrapped around cocktail-sized hot dogs snugly. The wrapped franks were arranged on baking sheets with the dough seam facing down, sometimes brushed with melted butter or beaten egg for extra golden color. As they baked, the dough puffed up and turned flaky and golden, while the franks inside steamed and stayed juicy, creating combinations of textures that made every bite satisfying. In the 1970s, Black households, pigs in blankets represented quick, crowd-pleasing appetizers. Children loved them because they were perfectly sized for little hands.
Cornmeal coating techniques brought distinctive Southern crunch to fried fish, okra, and countless other dishes. African American cooks understood that cornmeal required different handling than flour, demanding specific textures to achieve its signature crispy coating. The cornmeal was often stone ground locally, with coarser textures preferred for fish, while finer grinds worked better for vegetables. Seasoning was mixed directly into cornmeal, with some cooks adding small amounts of flour to improve adhesion, while others used pure cornmeal for maximum crunch. The coating process required pressing food firmly into the meal, ensuring complete coverage that formed an unbroken shell during frying. Temperature control was critical with cornmeal, as it browned faster than flour. These techniques defined Southern fried catfish.
Pig ear sandwiches were another example of how Black families wasted nothing and found flavor where others saw scraps. Pig ears, which butchers often sold cheaply, were boiled until tender, then sliced thin and placed between bread with mustard or hot sauce. The texture was chewy, but the taste was rich and savory, making them surprisingly satisfying. For many, these sandwiches became a dependable lunch or supper when more expensive meats were out of reach. They were especially common in rural towns where hogs were butchered at home and every part of the animal was used. Families knew that wasting nothing was not just thrifty, it was survival. Eating pig ears was also a mark of resilience, turning overlooked cuts into a food that people grew to enjoy. Today, pig ear sandwiches are remembered as a dish born from necessity, but filled with pride, showing just how much strength could be found in the humblest of meals. Corncob jelly was one of those miracles that made people smile at their own cleverness. When the corn was shucked and the cobs left behind, no one dared to throw them out. Those bare cobs went into a big pot of water, boiled until the water turned golden and sweet-smelling. Sugar and a little lemon juice got added next, then everything was strained until the liquid gleamed like honey. The result was a jelly that tasted faintly of corn, syrupy and light, the perfect spread for biscuits or toast. People used it when fruit was scarce, and it carried a quiet pride that came from turning scraps into sweetness. Grandparents remembered it from their childhood, when waste was not an option and imagination ruled the kitchen. Corncob jelly was proof that flavor could be coaxed out of what others might ignore. It was soft, shining, and made with patience. Those who tasted it never forgot that feeling of abundance born from scarcity. Each spoonful told the story of hands that worked hard, saved everything, and still found time to make something beautiful. Stuffed celery with cream cheese and pimento created colorful boats that children picked up by their crunchy handles, the creamy filling contrasting perfectly with the crisp, fresh vegetable that provided texture amidst holiday indulgence. Mothers would wash and trim celery stalks, cutting them into 3-inch lengths before drying them thoroughly and arranging them on serving platters like little canoes. The filling was made by beating cream cheese until fluffy, then folding in diced pimentos, mayonnaise, and seasonings like garlic powder, onion powder, and black pepper. The cream cheese mixture was spread generously into each celery groove, mounded slightly and sometimes garnished with paprika, chopped olives, or crispy bacon. In Black households during the 1970s, stuffed celery represented an attempt to include something fresh among heavier holiday offerings. Children loved them because the cream cheese provided richness while celery added refreshing crunch.
Lard and animal fats were the foundation of flavor in 1970s soul food kitchens, providing richness that vegetable oils simply cannot match. Every serious cook kept a container of rendered pork fat near the stove, ready to add depth to vegetables, fry chicken to golden perfection, or create flaky biscuit crusts. The fat came from home-butchered hogs or local butchers who understood real cooking. This was about taste and tradition, passed through generations who knew flavor lived in the fat. When grandmothers fried catfish or made pie crusts, they reached for lard without hesitation. The move toward processed oils changed soul food fundamentally. What we gained in supposed health benefits, we lost in the unmistakable richness that once defined every dish.
Pickled watermelon rind was a dish born out of a waste-not spirit. When families ate fresh watermelon, they saved the rinds, slicing off the tough green skin and brining the white flesh in vinegar, sugar, and spices. The result was a tangy, sweet pickle that could be eaten alongside meats, beans, or cornbread. In hard times, nothing edible was thrown away, and this recipe proved that even scraps could become something delicious. Pickled rind added brightness to plates that were otherwise heavy with starch and salt, lifting meals and making them feel more balanced. Children loved the odd flavor, and adults appreciated that it stretched food supplies further. Pickled watermelon rind became common in many Southern households, passed down as a recipe of ingenuity. It turned what was once destined for the trash into something cherished, embodying the creativity of Black families making do with what they had. Crumb-fried saltfish was proof that even the toughest cuts could be transformed with a little creativity. Saltfish was cheap and lasted forever, but it was hard and strong-flavored, needing love and time to make it shine. Families would soak it overnight, then roll it in crushed biscuit crumbs before frying it in a skillet until golden. The smell of it could draw neighbors from down the street, salty and rich with that perfect crisp edge. Paired with grits or boiled greens, it made breakfast feel like a celebration. The crumbs gave it crunch, the oil gave it warmth, and the memories gave it meaning. In every Southern kitchen, there was a version of this dish waiting to happen, handed down and reimagined through generations. Crumb-fried saltfish was not fancy food, it was pride disguised as thrift, a simple recipe that carried the power to feed both stomach and spirit. Ham biscuits made with country ham and soft dinner rolls became handheld sandwiches that children devoured, the salty ham contrasting perfectly with the sweet, buttery rolls that held everything together. Mothers would slice country ham paper thin, the intensely salty, cured meat packed with flavor that needed only small amounts to satisfy, then tuck the slices into soft dinner rolls that had been split and buttered. Some families brushed the tops of the assembled biscuits with melted butter and baked them briefly to warm everything through and create slightly crispy tops. The combination of salty, savory ham with soft, slightly sweet rolls created perfect flavor balance that kept people coming back for more. In 1970s Black households, ham biscuits represented Southern tradition, appetizers that could be prepared ahead and served at room temperature. Children loved ham biscuits because they were familiar comfort food in easy-to-eat form, requiring no plates or utensils and perfect for grabbing.
Wood stoves and slow cooking defined the pace and flavor of 1970s soul food in ways electric ranges cannot replicate. Many African American households, especially in the rural South, still cooked on wood-burning stoves requiring constant attention that rewarded patience with unmatched results. The heat was uneven and demanded skill, teaching cooks to rotate pots, adjust dampers, and develop intuition modern appliances made unnecessary. Food cooked this way absorbed subtle smoke flavors and developed textures through hours of gentle simmering. Collard greens, neck bones, and beans transformed over these stoves into dishes with depth that instant pots cannot create. The decline of wood stove cooking took something irreplaceable from soul food tradition. What we gained in speed, we lost in patient flavors only time and fire could create.
Hog maw stew was a dish that took something most would discard and transformed it into a centerpiece for the table. Hog maw, the lining of a pig's stomach, was cleaned carefully, then stuffed with potatoes, onions, and spices before being simmered until tender. The result was hearty, filling, and deeply flavorful, stretching small amounts of ingredients into a meal that could feed an entire family. In times when money was scarce, hog maw stew allowed families to make use of what they had, proving that nothing from the animal went to waste. It was often served at gatherings where one pot had to go far, reminding everyone of the value of sharing and stretching food. The dish carried cultural roots tied to both survival and celebration, a reminder that even hard times could produce food that comforted and united. Hog maw stew was not fancy, but it represented ingenuity, thrift, and strength in the face of want.
Hog killings in late fall provided fresh pork that transformed soul food for months afterward. Families gathered when temperatures dropped enough to safely process meat, turning a single hog into hams, bacon, sausage, and countless cuts. Nothing was wasted because every part had value, from the head becoming souse to intestines cleaned for chitterlings. The work was hard but communal, with neighbors helping each other and sharing the bounty. Fresh pork from a well-fed hog tasted entirely different from supermarket meat, its fat sweeter and flesh more flavorful. The transition to commercial processing eliminated not just this community ritual, but the quality of meat that made soul food exceptional. What we buy now cannot approach the taste of hogs raised on scraps, acorns, and thyme.
Green tomato slices served with remoulade sauce were crispy, tangy bites that introduced children to Southern traditions, the cornmeal coating providing crunch while the tart tomato inside stayed firm and flavorful. Mothers would slice green tomatoes thick, dredge them in seasoned cornmeal mixed with flour and spices, then fry them in hot oil until golden brown and crispy. The remoulade sauce was made from mayonnaise, mustard, pickles, capers, and spices, creating a tangy, creamy dip that complemented the fried tomatoes perfectly. Each slice was served hot with a small dish of sauce for dipping, the combination of temperatures and textures making every bite interesting. In 1970s, Black households, fried green tomatoes represented end-of-season resourcefulness, using tomatoes that wouldn't ripen before frost to create something delicious. Children loved fried green tomatoes because they were crispy like French fries but tasted tangy and different, expanding their understanding of what vegetables could be. Hominy pancakes were another clever way families stretched resources into filling meals. Hominy, boiled corn kernels treated with lye, was folded into simple flour batter and fried on a hot griddle until crisp on the edges. The result was a pancake that was hearty, chewy, and rich in flavor. Families leaned on this dish because hominy was inexpensive, filling, and often available in bulk. These pancakes were served plain or topped with syrup, molasses, or even just butter when sugar was scarce. Children enjoyed the slightly nutty texture, while adults appreciated that it carried them through long hours of work. Hominy pancakes were tied to heritage too, with roots reaching back to Native American food traditions that influenced Southern cooking. They were a reminder of resilience and cultural continuity, showing how simple staples could be reinvented to meet new needs. Hominy pancakes filled stomachs, but they also filled mornings with the comfort of tradition and the creativity of making do. Peach preserves with biscuits brought the sweetness of summer into the cold months of winter. Families would boil down ripe peaches with sugar until thick, sealing them in jars to last through the year. Spread over hot biscuits, the preserves offered both comfort and nourishment when fresh fruit was long gone. Canning peaches was a yearly ritual, tying families to the cycles of the land and the rhythm of harvest. It required time and patience, but the reward was sweetness that carried through the hardest seasons. Biscuits were a perfect partner, soft, warm, and filling, making peach preserves a special treat that brightened tables. For children, it was a taste of abundance in months of scarcity, a reminder that summer fruit could still be enjoyed when snow or frost covered the fields. Peach preserves with biscuits were both practical and emotional, offering joy from jars of hard work. They carried hope through cold winters.
Hand-cranked ice cream at summer gatherings produced texture and freshness that store-bought versions cannot match. Families gathered on porches, taking turns at the crank while rock salt and ice worked their magic on custard made from fresh cream, eggs, and fruit. The process was slow and communal, building anticipation until the dasher stopped and the reward could be served. Children fought over who got to lick the paddle, while adults scooped portions into waiting bowls. The ice cream that emerged was dense, intensely flavored, and so cold it made teeth ache. Peaches picked that morning gave each batch seasonal character impossible to replicate commercially. When electric freezers and store-bought cartons replaced the hand-crank ritual, dessert became convenient but lost the event that made it meaningful.
Collard green and onion hash gave leafy greens a starring role, turning a traditional dinner side into a savory breakfast companion. Fresh collard greens were sliced thin and quickly sautéed with sweet onions, a little garlic, and a splash of vegetable broth until tender yet vibrant. The result was a smoky, nutrient-rich hash that paired beautifully with eggs, grits, or cornbread. Some families added diced potatoes for extra heartiness, while others seasoned with a pinch of red pepper flakes to wake up the taste buds. This dish reflected a deep appreciation for garden vegetables and the ingenuity of African-American cooks who brought dinner flavors to the morning table. Collard green and onion hash provided iron, vitamins, and a satisfying warmth that lasted through long days. Its quick preparation and bold taste made it a weekday favorite, while its connection to Southern tradition made it feel timeless, proving that breakfast could be as wholesome and flavorful as any evening meal. Macaroni salad with diced vegetables served in small cups was creamy comfort food that children recognized and loved. The familiar pasta combined with mayonnaise, pickles, and vegetables, creating flavors that felt like home. Mothers would cook elbow macaroni until tender, drain it, and rinse with cold water before mixing it with mayonnaise, diced celery, chopped pickles, diced bell peppers, hard-boiled eggs, and seasonings. The salad was chilled for several hours, then served in small portions with spoons. Some families added mustard for tang, others included diced pimentos for color, each version reflecting family preferences. In the 1970s, Black households, macaroni salad represented familiar comfort brought to the appetizer table, showing that holiday food didn't always need to be fancy. Children loved macaroni salad because it tasted familiar and satisfying, like picnic food that reminded them of summer even during cold November. Molasses milk drink was a common way to stretch both sweeteners and dairy during times of hardship. Hot milk, often reconstituted from powdered milk, was whisked with a spoonful of molasses until warm and smooth. The result was a drink that children could have before school or adults could sip before long workdays. It carried natural sweetness and important nutrients from molasses, while offering comfort when sugar was too costly to use. Families appreciated it because it was affordable, easy to prepare, and nourishing. Many children who grew up during lean times remembered this drink as both a treat and a necessity, even if they preferred chocolate or sugar when they could get it. The molasses milk drink proved that small substitutions could keep sweetness alive in daily life without breaking ration limits. It was simple, practical, and tied directly to the struggles of everyday survival, becoming a quiet but important memory of perseverance. Churn milk soup was what you made when you had finished making butter and still needed a meal. That leftover buttermilk became the base for a tangy, hearty soup that could feed a family from a single pot. It was mixed with cornmeal, herbs, and whatever vegetables were on hand, then simmered until it thickened like velvet. The smell was sharp but cozy, filling the kitchen with warmth and familiarity. Some families dropped bits of bread into the bowl, letting it soak up the flavor. It was simple food, born from old farm routines and frugal wisdom. Churn milk soup taught that nothing should ever be wasted, not even the scraps of a good day's work. It soothed hunger and reminded everyone that comfort could come from the most ordinary things. With each spoonful, it carried the echo of laughter and work from generations before. Spinach dip, served with crackers and vegetables, was creamy, savory goodness that children scooped up enthusiastically. The rich cream cheese and sour cream base mixed with chopped spinach and seasonings, creating dips that tasted indulgent. Aunties would thaw frozen chopped spinach and squeeze out all the excess water before mixing it with softened cream cheese, sour cream, mayonnaise, dried vegetable soup mix, and sometimes water chestnuts for added crunch. The mixture was stirred together until smooth and well combined, then refrigerated for several hours to allow flavors to meld and develop depth. Some families served the dip cold, while others baked it briefly to create warm, bubbling cheese pulls that made every scoop exciting. In 1970s, Black households, spinach dip represented modern entertaining. recipes that came from package instructions but became beloved traditions. Children loved spinach dip because the vegetables were hidden in creamy richness, making them willing to eat greens.
Homemade hot sauce sat on every soul food table in the 1970s, its heat calibrated to family preferences over years of careful adjustment. These sauces were crafted from garden peppers preserved in vinegar, sometimes with garlic or fruit, always with character that bottled brands could not replicate. Each family's version was unique, passed down and tweaked until it became as personal as a signature. The heat was layered and complex, building rather than attacking, complementing food instead of overwhelming it. Shaking that familiar bottle over fried fish or greens connected each meal to countless meals before it. Commercial hot sauces offer convenience, but sacrifice individuality that made homemade versions irreplaceable. When those family recipes stopped being made, something essential disappeared from soul food tables.
Sugar cane sticks were the simplest kind of sweetness, and they carried a special memory for children who grew up with little. Fresh cane was cut into sticks, peeled and chewed for its sweet juice, offering a natural candy when refined sugar or store-bought treats were out of reach. For many children in the South, walking home with a stick of sugar cane was as good as holding a chocolate bar. It was affordable, long-lasting, and carried the earthy, raw sweetness of the land itself. Parents loved it because it kept children happy without costing much, and it taught the value of finding joy in small things. Sugar cane sticks carried the reminder that sweetness did not need to come from a store, but from fields worked by hand. They were part of the rhythm of rural life, tied to harvests and family memories. Even in the toughest years, sugar cane sticks brought happiness. Salt and sugar apples were a quick delight on long afternoons when the pantry was bare. A single apple could become a treat with just a pinch of salt and a sprinkle of sugar rubbed into its skin. The salt made the sweetness shine, the sugar made the tartness dance, and together they created a taste sharper than candy. Children learned this trick from mothers and grandmothers who refused to let poverty steal joy. It was a snack that cost nothing but offered everything: brightness, laughter, and something to hold on to. Workers carried salted apples to the fields, students packed them for lunch, and families ate them under porches as the day cooled. The juice ran down your fingers, sticky and satisfying, proof that small pleasures still existed even when times were hard. Salt and sugar apples were a symbol of gratitude, of finding sweetness in hardship. They taught a quiet lesson that flavor does not come from excess, but from attention. Every bite felt like hope, crisp, honest, and alive.
The silky texture of properly made beans came directly from parts we now throw away. Cooking over open fires at family reunions added smoke and char that indoor cooking cannot achieve. Large gatherings happened outdoors, where men tended pits dug in the ground, cooking whole hogs or massive quantities of ribs over hardwood coals. The smoke infused meat with flavor that no grill can fully replicate. Uncontrolled heat created variations in texture, producing crispy bits and tender sections, making each serving unique. Children watched and learned how to tend fires, understanding that cooking over flame was different from turning a knob. The social ritual of outdoor cooking brought families together around heat and smoke in ways microwave dinners never could. When these gatherings became less frequent, soul food lost both the cooking method and the community context that gave it meaning.
Cream cheese and olive pinwheels, made with softened cream cheese mixed with chopped green olives and rolled in tortillas, created tangy, savory bites. Children found intriguing. Aunties would soften cream cheese and mix it with finely chopped green olives, pimentos, and sometimes a touch of garlic powder, spreading the mixture evenly on flour tortillas. The tortillas were rolled tightly, wrapped in plastic, and refrigerated for hours to firm up before being sliced into colorful pinwheels. Each slice revealed swirls of white cream cheese dotted with green olive pieces, creating visual appeal that drew children's attention. In 1970s, Black households, these pinwheels represented creative entertaining, showing how simple ingredients could become elegant appetizers. Children loved them because they were fun to look at, easy to eat, and introduced them to olives in a creamy format that made the vegetables more approachable and less intimidating than eating them whole.
Cooking with love and patience was not just sentiment, but a tangible ingredient in 1970s soul food that hurried meals lack. Grandmothers stood over stoves for hours because they understood that attention affected outcomes in ways recipes could not explain. They tasted constantly, adjusted seasoning by intuition, and refused to serve anything before its time. This patience allowed flavors to develop fully, textures to soften properly, and dishes to reach their potential. The emotional investment showed in every bite because food made with hurry never tasted right. Children learned that cooking was an act of love expressed through ingredients and time. When convenience became priority, soul food lost the intangible element that elevated it beyond nutrition. The same recipes made quickly never achieve what slow cooking once created.
Homemade cracklins were a prized treat made from pork skins, fried until golden and crisp. Families would render down hog fat and save the skins, cutting them into pieces that crackled in hot lard as they cooked. The result was crunchy, salty, and deeply flavorful, often eaten with cornbread or sprinkled over greens. Nothing went to waste, and cracklins were proof of how families found ways to enjoy even the humblest scraps. They carried a strong connection to hog butchering days, when entire communities gathered to process a hog and share every part of it. Cracklins added texture and flavor to otherwise plain meals, and for many, they were a reminder of both thrift and celebration. Though inexpensive, they carried a sense of richness and taste that lifted spirits. Homemade cracklins showed how food could be both practical and deeply satisfying, even in the hardest of times. Turnip-top dumplings were humble food turned holy. You started with a pot of greens simmering low, their smoky scent winding through the house. Bits of flour dough were pinched and dropped into the bubbling pot, swelling as they cooked and soaking up every trace of pepper and salt. The broth grew thick and rich, tasting of the land and the love poured into it. People called it poor man's stew, but it filled the heart as much as the belly. Served steaming in old bowls, it felt like warmth made visible. Children dipped crusts of bread into it while adults closed their eyes and savored the peace it brought. The dumplings were soft and chewy, little pockets of memory, flavored by patience and time. It was a meal for winter nights, for families gathered close, for prayers whispered over steam. Turnip-top dumplings carried a lesson that still matters. Food is never about wealth, but about care. In every spoonful was the proof that small things, done with love, could feed a world. Smoked oysters on crackers with hot sauce were adventurous bites that curious children tried. The smoky, briny oysters creating complex flavors that divided people into lovers and haters with no middle ground. Fathers would open tins of smoked oysters packed in oil, arranging them on serving platters surrounded by crackers and providing small bottles of hot sauce for those who wanted extra heat. The oysters had a strong, distinctive flavor, smoky from the curing process and intensely oceanic. Each oyster was placed on a cracker, sometimes with a tiny drop of hot sauce, creating bite-sized portions that delivered maximum flavor. In 1970s, Black households smoked oysters represented coastal sophistication and culinary bravery, appetizers that showed guests the host was willing to serve bold, distinctive foods. Children who tried smoked oysters either loved them immediately or swore them off forever, the strong flavor creating lasting memories.
Recipes passed down orally carry measurements and techniques that written instructions could never capture. Grandmothers taught by demonstration, showing exactly how much salt fit in a palm, how batter should look when mixed, and when greens had cooked long enough by their color. This knowledge was embodied, stored in hands and eyes rather than paper, refined through generations. Each family's version of common dishes differed based on these transmissions, creating distinctive tastes belonging to specific bloodlines. The cook's judgment mattered more than any recipe because she knew when to add more liquid and when a dish was done. As families scattered and oral traditions broke, this embodied knowledge disappeared. Cookbooks captured ingredients but missed the intuition that made the difference between adequate food and soul food.
Saus, also known as head cheese, was a dish made from pig scraps that turned thrift into sustenance. The meat from a pig's head, including tongue and cheeks, was simmered, chopped, and set in a broth with vinegar and spices. Once cooled, it formed a terrine-like dish that could be sliced and served cold, usually with bread. Families valued it because it made use of parts of the hog that others ignored, ensuring that nothing edible was wasted. Saus carried tangy flavors from the vinegar and a dense texture that was filling and practical. Though not everyone loved it, those who grew up with it remembered it as a staple on the table during lean times. It represented survival and ingenuity, transforming scraps into something lasting. In households where every bite mattered, saus stood as proof that determination and resourcefulness could make even the most overlooked cuts into meaningful food. Blackberry molasses cobbler was a sticky, smoky dessert that belonged to cast-iron skillets and long summer nights. The berries were gathered wild from fence lines and hedges, their juice staining fingers and laughter alike. Mixed with thick, dark molasses and a handful of sugar, they turned into a bubbling, fragrant filling. The crust was poured over top, sometimes biscuit dough, sometimes batter, and baked until the edges burned just enough to taste like smoke. It was messy and imperfect, but that was part of its beauty. The syrup thickened into a glossy black glaze that clung to every bite, sweet with a whisper of bitterness. People spooned it hot into bowls, sometimes with milk or cream, but it never needed help. Blackberry molasses cobbler tasted like work and reward, like something earned under the sun. It was the dessert that reminded families that sweetness could survive the hardest days, that joy could bubble up even from thorns. Pickled shrimp marinated in vinegar, oil, and spices created tangy, flavorful bites that adventurous children tried. The cold, tender shrimp infused with herbs and aromatics that made them taste complex. Aunties would boil shrimp until just cooked, then peel them and place them in jars or bowls where they were covered with a marinade of vinegar, oil, sliced onions, bay leaves, peppercorns, and sometimes lemon slices. The shrimp marinated for at least 24 hours, absorbing the tangy, aromatic flavors and developing a pickled taste that was both refreshing and sophisticated. The marinated shrimp were served cold with toothpicks for easy serving, the onions and bay leaves removed or left in depending on family preference. In Black households during the 1970s, pickled shrimp represented make-ahead convenience, appetizers that actually improved with time. Children who tried pickled shrimp discovered seafood could be tangy and bright.
Buttermilk from local dairies had a tangy richness that modern cultured versions cannot match. Real buttermilk was a liquid left after churning butter, thin and flavorful with natural bacteria that made biscuits rise and fried chicken coat and crisp perfectly. Dairies delivered it fresh in glass bottles, and cooks used it within days while it retained character. This buttermilk made cornbread tender, lightened batters, and added complexity to every recipe. The live cultures interacted with baking soda to create lift that artificial versions achieve less effectively. When small dairies closed and commercial cultured buttermilk replaced the real thing, soul food lost an irreplaceable ingredient. The biscuits, cornbread, and fried chicken we make now are approximations of dishes that once tasted noticeably better.
Smoked turkey necks with beans were a dish that carried deep, smoky flavor into a pot of humble legumes. Turkey necks were affordable and often overlooked at markets, making them perfect for families who needed cheap protein. Simmered slowly with beans, onions, and peppers, The necks released flavor that transformed plain beans into a rich, hearty stew. The meat could be picked from the bones and mixed back in, ensuring that nothing was wasted. This dish was particularly popular in the South, where smoked meats were prized for their ability to season large pots of food. Served with cornbread, it provided warmth and satisfaction that carried families through long days. Smoked turkey necks with beans became a reminder that flavor did not depend on expensive cuts, but on patience and tradition. It was food that spoke to both survival and comfort, feeding bodies and spirits in difficult years. Rice and molasses supper was one of the simplest meals, but also one of the most remembered. A pot of rice was inexpensive, filling, and always on hand, but paired with a drizzle of molasses, it turned into something sweet and sustaining. Sugar was too costly for everyday use, but molasses was affordable and sold in larger tins that seemed to last forever. Families poured it over steaming bowls of rice, letting the dark syrup seep into the grains until they gleamed. The taste was rich, almost smoky, with just enough sweetness to make children smile. It was often eaten at the end of the day when no meat could be spared, and it carried people through the night with enough strength to face the next morning. My grandmother told me rice and molasses was a treat disguised as necessity, proof that resourcefulness could soften the edge of scarcity. In the 1960s, when Black families were stretching every dollar, rice and molasses kept hunger at bay while still offering a touch of comfort. Simple, cheap, and unforgettable, it was a meal born of need but remembered with love. Cheese wafers made with sharp cheddar and butter created crispy, salty crackers that children munched by the handful, their homemade quality far superior to anything store-bought could offer. Grandmothers would cream softened butter with finely shredded sharp cheddar cheese, then gradually add flour, salt, and cayenne pepper until the mixture formed a stiff dough. The dough was rolled into logs, wrapped in wax paper, and chilled until firm, then sliced into thin rounds and baked until golden brown and crispy. As they baked, the cheese melted into the butter and flour, creating crackers that were rich, savory, and addictively crunchy, with just a hint of heat from the cayenne. In 1970s Black households, cheese wafers represented Southern tradition and hospitality, recipes that had been passed down through generations. Children loved cheese wafers because they tasted like cheesy potato chips but felt more sophisticated since they were homemade.
Pig feet, ears, and tails added gelatin and richness to 1970s soul food that lean, modern cuts cannot provide. Cooks understood that these odd parts, simmered for hours, released collagen, making beans silky, greens unctuous, and broths impossibly rich. Nothing was wasted because everything had value, and parts most people discarded were often most flavorful. Preparing these cuts required knowledge and patience, skills passed from mothers to daughters who understood texture came from fat and connective tissue. The dishes made with these ingredients had body that amazed anyone unfamiliar with traditional techniques. When convenience eliminated these parts from shopping lists, soul food lost depth that cannot be replaced with lean pork loin. Homegrown vegetables from backyard gardens brought freshness to 1970s. Soul food that grocery store produce cannot touch. Families cultivated collards, tomatoes, okra, and squash in small plots, picking them hours before they reached the dinner table. The soil was rich with compost, producing vegetables with intense flavor that mass-produced crops lack. Children helped tend these gardens, learning which plants needed more water and when to harvest for peak taste. This connection to the earth meant every meal carried the pride of self-sufficiency. Tomatoes tasted like summer itself, and collard greens held sweetness that disappeared once shipped across the country in refrigerated trucks. The loss of backyard gardens severed a direct link between families and their food, replacing it with bland supermarket convenience.
Stewed rutabagas were a staple in Southern kitchens during lean years, a root vegetable that could be boiled down and flavored with pork fat for depth. Rutabagas were cheap, stored well through the winter and filled in for potatoes when those were too expensive or scarce. Families would peel, chop, and simmer them until tender, often serving them alongside beans or cornbread to complete a meal. The dish was hearty without being costly, and it carried a slightly sweet, earthy flavor that grew familiar to children who had little else on their plates. Pork fat or drippings were often added to give richness, turning the humble root into something more comforting. Stewed rutabagas became a dish tied to survival, reflecting both garden ingenuity and frugality. They were not glamorous, but they were dependable, and that mattered most. For many families, a pot of rutabagas simmering on the stove was the scent of perseverance. They represented sustenance and simplicity in the hardest of times. Chicken liver pâté spread on crackers created rich, smooth bites that adventurous children tried, the creamy texture and distinctive flavor introducing them to foods that felt grown-up and sophisticated. Aunties would sauté chicken livers with onions and butter until cooked through but still slightly pink inside, then blend them with cream cheese, spices, and sometimes brandy or sherry until smooth. The pâté was chilled in molds or ramekins, then unmolded onto serving platters surrounded by crackers and garnished with chopped parsley or capers. The texture was silky smooth, while the flavor was rich and slightly metallic in that characteristic liver way that some loved and others found challenging. In Black households during the 1970s, chicken liver pâté represented culinary sophistication, recipes borrowed from French cuisine and adapted to Southern ingredients. Children who tried it felt brave and grown up, stepping outside their comfort zones to taste foods their parents enjoyed at special gatherings. Homemade vinegar pie was a dessert that showed just how clever cooks could be in the face of scarcity. With fruit hard to come by, families learned to create a pie filling from vinegar, sugar, butter, and flour, which baked into a sweet, tangy custard-like dessert. It was not the same as apple or lemon, but it offered brightness and sweetness when nothing else was available. Vinegar pie became a symbol of ingenuity, proof that even pantry staples could turn into something special. Served at Sunday dinners or holidays, it gave families a sense of normalcy when times were anything but normal. The taste was surprising, tart yet sweet, simple yet memorable. Families passed recipes down through word of mouth, and many children remembered vinegar pie as the dessert that made hard days feel less heavy. It carried the message that joy and resourcefulness could coexist in the kitchen. Vinegar pie became a reminder of how far determination could stretch.
Seasoned salt blending was a personalized art that gave each family's fried foods their distinctive taste. African American cooks created custom spice mixtures combining salt with paprika, garlic powder, onion powder, black pepper, and sometimes cayenne. These blends were mixed in large batches and stored in repurposed jars, always within arm's reach during cooking. The proportions varied by family, with some preferring heavier garlic notes while others emphasized heat. Children grew up recognizing their grandmother's specific seasoned salt as the taste of home, a flavor impossible to replicate with store-bought alternatives. Some cooks guarded exact ratios as closely held secrets, revealing them only to trusted family members. These personalized blends transformed identical ingredients into dishes that tasted uniquely like one kitchen.
Fried rabbit was a dish that came from necessity when families could not afford store-bought meat. Rabbits were plentiful in rural areas, and children often learned to hunt them with traps or small rifles. Once cleaned, the meat was seasoned, dredged in flour or cornmeal, and fried in hot lard until crisp. Rabbit meat was lean but tender, and it provided a valuable source of protein at no cost beyond effort. Families relied on it to fill gaps in their diets, especially during years when hogs or chickens were too expensive to raise in number. Fried rabbit was often served with potatoes or greens, turning it into a complete meal. It carried memories of resourcefulness, where survival was tied directly to skill and the land's offerings. For many, fried rabbit represented both struggle and pride, proof that families could take care of themselves when markets and money failed them. It was a food of resilience.
Sharing food with neighbors created accountability that kept soul food standards impossibly high. When you knew your greens might be served next door or your cake carried to a sick friend, every dish represented your family's cooking legacy. This social pressure meant no shortcuts, no lazy substitutions, no serving anything less than your best. Neighbors talked, and a reputation for excellent cooking was earned over years and lost in a single disappointing dish. The food that left your kitchen carried your name, so pride demanded perfection. Children delivered plates to elderly neighbors and returned with honest reviews. When neighborhoods fractured and people stopped sharing food across fences, soul food lost this quality control system. Cooking only for immediate family removed the social stakes that once made every meal matter.
Which 1970s soul food recipe does your family need right now? Drop your memories in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe so we can keep bringing these essential dishes back to life.